Hello, welcome again to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Today I have Evan here with me today, and we talked about having a conversation on the theme of displacement. Uh, on this podcast, we often talk about localizing or localism and the sense of place, but I think what we also need to realize is that many people are displaced, either because they grew up in Western society and their parents moved around, their grandparents moved around, and they feel placeless, but also because they were forced to be displaced, either through due to political reasons or increasingly due to shifting climate conditions, and many others as well. And so we thought we'd talk about kind of this theme of displacement, refugees as well, the idea of refugees, and related to many kind of related topics that are relevant to Evan's life. So why don't we start by, Evan, why don't you introduce yourself, a little bit about your background, and maybe set the stage a little bit of kind of some of the themes that you want to dig into here.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate the invitation. My name is Evan Welkin, and I'm originally from the Cascadia bioregion. And so the theme of displacement began for me quite young because I was born in a declining logging community. So right from the start, I was witness to the helicopter logging that was beginning to happen in that area because there was no good wood left in an easily available place. So these communities, in order to survive, were increasingly going to more and more desperate measures to keep the logging industry alive, including, pulling up logs from inaccessible ridge tops with heavy equipment and helicopters. And so I really have this deep, vivid memory of helicopters flying overhead as some of my earliest memories, with huge, second growth or even old growth wood still, flying below them. And, at the same time, below the rotors, my family had chosen that place to live as part of an intentional community. So we were a kind of, back to the land project with sort of a dispersed in a hills of the Oregon Coast Range, community of folks trying to connect with each other, connect more with the land, do community projects together. And so that really left an important imprint for me. And I'm sure we'll get more into it, but I think over the course of my life, particularly coming from the Pacific Northwest, which has this history of having been an extraction-based industry since the arrival of white settlers. I think that's really been a real underlying theme in my life experience for sure.
Okay. So one the way that my understanding is that the way that you met your wife was that you were both activists for kind of human rights for Palestinians, right, and living conditions for Palestinians. Do you want to talk about that work? Obviously, it's very relevant in the news today. Do you want to talk about kind of how you got into that work? If you want to talk a little bit about meeting your wife that way, and a little bit about how you see the situation today. And obviously, this is a situation where both peoples are unsettled or have been unsettled or displaced throughout history, and so it's a very difficult situation. Do you want to talk about it?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think it fits really well within this theme of displacement, because I first began to get interested in the region of Israel and Palestine because my mother is originally from Turkey, and so I had that part of the world in mind. But it really came home to me when I studied abroad in high school. So from my home in the Pacific Northwest, I picked up at 16 and went to study for a year with a Turkish family in Turkey. And within a month of my arrival, September 11th happened back in the United States. And I was really struck that even as what I had considered myself to be a fairly open-minded, like politically conscious person, I was surprised that everybody around me there, and when I say everybody, I mean really the common narrative understood by all the Turks around me was that that event was a direct consequence of U.S. support for Israel.
Hmm.
I mean, it was talked about in the press. It was talked about by my host family. I mean, people of all kinds of different political persuasions. And I think a really key takeaway for me about that was, wow, there's whole different narratives, not just sort of maybe superficial ways that we see cultural differences, or oh wow, he eats that way and I eat that way, this way. It was just profoundly a different worldview, making sense for everybody around me of what I think for many people from the US was a profoundly surprising event. I mean, even if we saw it as sort of chickens coming home to roost or whatever, I think many of us asked questions of like, well, why did this happen on that day? And it really got me thinking about like kind of what are some of these root causes. And these people around me were telling me it was our support for Israel, and I wanted to know more about what that really meant. So, upon completing that experience and going through high school, I ended up going to a college in North Carolina where I was in class with a number of Palestinian students who had just gone through the Second Intifada. So the war in Iraq had just begun. The Second Intifada was winding down in Palestine, or had been brutally repressed. And these students were fired up about U.S. imperialism, about Palestinian identity. This is a point where it began to be like possible to like show the Palestinian flag and like talk about Palestinian resistance and nonviolent resistance included, in a way that was also new for me. And
Hmm.
so I was really influenced by hearing these students who were my peers talk about their life experience and what they'd lived through, just in order to have the opportunity to go to school and then eventually get the opportunity to go abroad and study in the US.
Hmm.
Similar in reflecting on my own experience of going abroad and studying in Turkey. And so I thought a lot at that time about, what does it mean to be, um, at risk or insecure in your own home place. And of course, again, I was aware of the historical injustices that had led to the development of the idea of Zionism and Jews coming to the land of Israel as a way of feeling like they could create a state. But frankly speaking, then with Palestinians who said, we didn't have anything to do with the Holocaust. Like, why do we need to pay for that?
Hmm.
That situation struck me and was certainly something I'd never heard before. So yeah, from there, I really began to get involved in Palestine solidarity activism. I worked at first in many of these projects that were kind of like, let's raise up both voices, let's find spaces for dialogue, because I felt that was right to sort of like try to help there be more space for public discourse on this issue. But again, I think the thing that increasingly became clear to me was that the disproportionality of the conflict in Israel and Palestine was so great that it was a disservice, I think, at sometimes to like put a Palestinian young person and an Israeli young person up on stage and say, we're looking for pathways to dialogue, when at the root of the problem was still this fact that the Palestinian was under military occupation, and that Israeli, whether they had already done or were going to, would soon be forced into military service to actually perpetuate that military occupation.
Hmm.
And so all of that, I think, then really did get me back to thinking about my early experiences of being from a place where destruction and constant sense of instability of the place, my home place, really resonated. And to be fair, in that situation, I was resonating more with the experience of Palestinians who were talking about that being a part of their day-to-day life. And so I increasingly got involved and did more and more Palestinian solidarity activism. I ended up working for an organization, the Rachel Corrie Foundation, which was a foundation set up by the family of Rachel Corrie, who is from my hometown in Olympia, Washington. She was killed in Rafah, in the southern part of the west of Gaza, by an Israeli bulldozer trying to demolish a house. And she had basically put herself in front of that house to prevent it from being demolished. And she was run over by those same bulldozers that are now, again, raising homes in Gaza as this Israeli offensive has really ramped up. And so all of that then eventually led to me really wanting to go to Palestine and see with my own eyes what was going on. Because people kept saying, you can understand it on a kind of intellectual level, but what you need to do is you need to go and see it with your own eyes. And so it took me some time to figure out how and when, but I ultimately went with a delegation that went all over the area, but particularly spent time in the southern part of the West Bank in an area called Masafar Yatta, which is in the southernmost part south of Hebron. It's a very rural, very economically marginalized part, even by Palestinian standards. Many people still live in caves or very, very close to the land as shepherds, some agriculture, but it's quite rough living there in the Negev desert. And the story of that whole area is that in the late 90s, the area had been fully evacuated. All of the people in that area had been displaced from Masafar Yatta by government orders to create a military training area in that whole zone. So the idea essentially was to basically take advantage of this idea of a military training zone to basically just kick hundreds of people out of their villages and homes and off their land in order to, of course, make more room for Israeli settlers and, military exercise in that space. And so what had actually miraculously happened is that as a result of that decision and displacement of such a huge number of people in a short period of time, is that Israeli activists rallied to bring the case to the Supreme Court. And in fact, the Supreme Court, in a very, very rare decision, ordered that families be allowed to return to their homes. And so that is what happened. So in the early 2000s, people returned to their homes. And of course, the settlers who had moved in the meantime were quite angry about this and began to really provoke and attack the Palestinians. And especially there's a particular instance in this village of Atuani where there's a central village where there's a school and then several small satellite villages around it that don't have schools or infrastructure. So students have to walk through the desert to come to the school. And what was happening is that settlers were actually attacking children on their way to school in the morning and in the afternoon as they crossed the desert. And so this village called in international support basically to bear witness to what was going on and support them in nonviolently resisting this this oppression. But realistically, this question of displacement then was always on their mind. The Supreme Court had judged in their favor that particular instance, but there was nothing saying that it couldn't happen again. And the settlers and the soldiers supporting the settlers were always ready to, confiscate more land or push people around in those spaces, prevent the children from going to school. So this theme of displacement was very much, very present for the folks in that village. And so when I visited the space, I came to see some of these villages that had been destroyed dozens of times. For example, some of them had been razed over and over and over again, and people just rebuilt, their shacks back in order to have some degree of stability. And in that space, I met my wife, who was working with an Italian human rights monitoring organization, partnered with the North American organization that I went with. And yeah, that's kind of how my relationship with her began. We kept in touch on the sort of the terms of sharing this experience in this part of the southern part of the West Bank in Masafariata.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. It's intense. I mean, we could do a whole podcast series on this conflict. It's such a a complex historical, deep historical conflict. Let me ask you this. Do you see, just given, looking at it from the other side, from the other perspective, of Zionism? I mean, do you see like the project of providing kind of safety and a homeland for people who have historically been persecuted in many of the places that they lived around the world, and have, especially after World War II, felt especially vulnerable, wherever they lived. Even today with this conflict, we're seeing the rise in anti-Semitism around the world. Jewish people are, many of them are feeling unsafe, and so the idea of having a homeland of themselves, that they have some kind of historical record of, belonging to, this is, and having, the British and later on the United States support this project of Zionism. Can you separate the project of Zionism and providing the safety with the project of, or can you separate Zionism with the project of providing safety for a group that has historically been dispossessed, marginalized, persecuted, but now is in a situation where there were already people there who had been there for hundreds of, if not thousands of years, and are also feeling, now this sense of dispossession and displacement?
Yes, and I think it's necessary. I think we have to, at this point, separate Zionism from a universal need for safety and security. I mean, I think we're seeing play out right now. Actually, and I want to take a step back a second to separate the question of Zionism per se. I'll admit that I myself am an anarchist, and so the principle of the state as an apparatus for providing safety is something I really would question. I can see, not just in Israel, but in the United States, in Morocco, that's continued to occupy Western Sahara, in so many instances around the world, we've seen the apparatus of the state not provide safety, despite the fact that it is meant to create a kind of national consensus around certain shared values. Almost since the beginning, we've seen that it's also then been fundamentally the root cause of a codification and a baked in exploitation of certain people who have against certain people who have not. And so I just want to start by saying that is the basic premise from which I am starting. Then when I go to, so I went on that delegation almost 15 years ago, when there was not such a massive consensus now that we see in the streets of people questioning what's going on in Gaza, for example, right now. At that time, I think it was not as clear to the world that Zionism was fundamentally premised from its beginning in the displacement and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their homeland. I mean, I think even I myself went saying, hey, all people should have a right to their own state, their own autonomy. I wasn't even such a convinced anarchist at that time. And yet then what I saw there was just so clearly unjust. And for example, I'll go back to the situation in Atuani. So many of the people who live in the West Bank as settlers are really there because it's a convenient place. It's cheaper, it's subsidized. You can go live in a settlement and have cheaper rent, cheaper utilities, all these kinds of things. Because of course, you're part of a larger, state project to dispossess other people of their land. You may or may not be potentially very ideologically committed to that idea, especially in some of the larger settlements like Marad Adumim or these places that are really just across the historic Green Line into the West Bank. And so you may not really be that ideological. But there are folks then in the southern part of the West Bank where I first met my wife who have to choose to really live pretty far off the grid, to be, in a situation that it's quite challenging to live that deeply into the desert. And those folks are firmly committed that, to this biblical narrative that they need to return to the historical land of Israel and make the desert bloom. So much so that that you can't really blame the state in that sense. Like they're really roughing it in many ways, in the same way the Palestinians next door are roughing it. They do have a disproportionate level of access to resources, to water that's brought in to make it possible for them to have things, cell service, electricity, all these kinds of things that this village really had to scrape to have. But interestingly, the other point is that many of them who I met personally and have spoken with are coming from the United States, are coming from other parts of the Western world to support this kind of ideological project. And I really ask myself, like, is it just that folks who, may have felt or experienced anti-Semitism in their countries of origin, be it the U.S. or other parts of the world, is it really just that as a result of the structure of the state of Israel, they have the right to come to a place that they've never been before, claim a piece of land for themselves, say that as a result of biblical, directive, nobody can question their rights to be there, and in fact, actively participate in threatening and hurting and denying the humanity of the people who were there before. And I think what's interesting for me is that I reflect on the fact that that is in fact how the state that I was born in was set up originally. We're, several hundred years further down the line, but I've also worked in Native American communities in my own, Pacific Northwest home place. And, they are dealing with the consequences of that dispossession generations later. And it may not be so vividly clear to us, the violence and the oppression that was required to allow for manifest destiny to dispossess them of everything. But we have absolutely displaced, millions of people in order to have the lifestyle we have. And to now then also export that same premise in the 21st century, knowing what we know, that people who were born and raised in the United States can then come to a whole nother country to repeat that same pattern. I think increasingly the world is waking up to the fact that simply isn't the way to build just or sustainable or regenerative future society.
Right. Okay. So I take it that you're half Turkish, but you're also an anarchist. That you're not in favor of reforming the Ottoman Empire to kind of sort all this out in multi-ethnic empire.
No, because interestingly, you can go and speak to many Palestinians who say, like, the last time I had the deed that I have for the land that I am, still clinging to here was provided by the Ottomans. And when empires changed and, the British signed the Balfour Declaration and just unilaterally, gave that same thing at, essentially negating that deed given by the previous empire. I mean, where are you left with? What
right?
Are we just going to bounce between either states or imperial projects? Like we got to find a better solution.
Right. So we're not. I mean, again. This is a whole rabbit hole we can keep going down. I guess the last thing I'll bring up on this topic is moving forward, right? What does decolonialization mean in a setting where the settlers have been there for decades, if not hundreds of years? What does it mean to provide some kind of historical justice? What does it mean to be an anarchist with these questions? What does it mean to be a bioregionalist with these questions? I noticed you mentioned you're from Cascadia, so you implied you're a bioregionalist. We'll also get into permaculture. You're also a permaculturalist. Uh, what do you think is I don't really see that many viable pathways forward. Um, Multi-state solution. You're not a statist. Most people think that's not really viable anyway. Multi-ethnic democracy, that also requires a state. What is a pathway forward here?
Well, I'm not going to pretend to be, qualified to solve the question of justice in the Middle East on my own. But I think back to my experience of, being born in rural Oregon. And for example, one of the key crises that really drew the community that I was born in together was the fact that increasingly, as logs became scarcer, the timber harvesters were actually also spraying defoliant on the forest in order to make it easier to ultimately then harvest logs. And at first, there was a lot of conflict in the community because these hippies had moved in. They were all about like environmentalism and and they were threatening the way of life of those people who'd like grown up in solidly as members of this logging community. And so there was a lot of tension there at first. And many of the loggers said, Earth first, we'll log the other planets later. And I think the ideological, divide there was intense, and I won't pretend that it ever really got fully resolved. But what ended up happening is that as they began to spray defoliants, and people began to see the real impact of like poison in the watershed, and the fact that the logging company really didn't care about either whether they were hippies or logging families below. They were just in it to make a buck. And what ended up happening is the community rallied together. Both loggers and hippies were able to take actually a suit against the logging companies for using substances that were in fact banned. Some of these were like surplus chemicals left over from Vietnam, which had been purely and clearly banned by the EPA, but were being used. Took them to court and won. And I see that as the kind of model that we can move forward on. And unfortunately, I think there's going to be some settlers in the southern part of the West Bank, as I say, who are so ideologically committed to the idea that their worldview precludes any idea of sharing, that they are the only chosen people. And I'm not sure how to overcome that kind of ideological rigidity.
Yeah.
But most Palestinians that I've spoke to, and many Israelis who I've also spoke with, and one can simply see, genuinely want peace. And unfortunately, in the models that we've been offered of statism, of imperialism, of capitalism, we see that peace and right relationship with the earth and functional living within our bioregion is incredibly difficult. We see really the end game of that model playing out in front of our eyes. So I think the imperative of this moment is that we need to try different models. And I think it really begins at the grassroots. And I think we need to find common cause around those things that we really believe in. And as I say, I'm not able to like offer the complete solution that will be applicable to every local community. But I think starting at those ecological resources that we share in common is a good place to begin. I think looking at common infrastructure and basic needs that we all share as both human and non-human life is an important place to begin. And once we really can focus on that element, my perception is that it can help us actually come together and fight for that common cause, which is really ultimately against capitalism at this point. I think we can see that the real enemy at this point is not Israel, is not our logging neighbor, is not even an extremist settler. The real enemy is capitalism.
Yeah, well, that could be a whole other conversation, is defining capitalism and how we differentiate capitalism from markets, and markets embedded in the commons. And oh boy, okay. Well, let's guide this conversation a little bit to, you talk about kind of creating common resources, investing in place. And you and your wife did this in Italy. You were developing, would you call it, a homestead, or what would you call it?
I mean, it's fairly large. It's what we'd call in Italian a borgo. So it's a collection of stone buildings around a central courtyard,
Okay.
on about 30 acres of land in the hills, near Bologna.
Okay, so this sounds very idyllic. This sounds like, okay, this is the way forward, and you've been doing this for a number of years now, and now you're thinking of getting ready to leave. So let's talk about this experience, this process, and why not be viable.
Yeah. So as a result of having met my wife Federica in the place where we met, and then recognizing that being a lifestyle activist was not really a way necessarily to put down roots for the long term. Um, we had the opportunity to return to her family's farm here in Italy, and as a result of our shared experience of having been activists, we saw that there was a really important need for places of refuge and re-entry, and kind of it's in Italy, it's called kind of like the slide from a really intense experience in a conflict zone in particular to whatever life will be next. Many times we saw other activists, like especially my wife, spend years in the field and then come to the end for whatever reason. In the case of many Israel-Palestine activists, what ends up happening is that eventually you get denied entry. You're basically banned from entering the country. And then people just fall, have no place to go. You've been dedicating your whole life and your identity to this cause, and then what? And so we saw many of those folks returning to this, a real sense of kind of mental, spiritual displacement, in the sense that you were fully invested in this idea of being in solidarity with people in this place, but all it really takes is the stroke of a pen to say, well, no, you're out. You're banned from returning to Israel for 5 years or even 10 years. Yeah. And folks oftentimes had no idea what to do with that. And so, and many of them were traumatized. Many of them were burnt out. Many of them had lived really difficult things in the field. And so our goal was to take on this farm and create a space for people in periods of transition. Our goal was to sort of offer a place of refuge for people who had been displaced in some way. And so we began with a group of people who all were ex-activists, with this group that my wife had been a part of, Operation Dove. And that was the sort of original imprint of the formation of our project. So our goal was to develop the farm around principles of organic and permaculture-based agriculture. We were very lucky in the fact that my in-laws already had been certified organic for many years, and in some ways were approaching that idea, but things like permaculture were new to them. They had made an incredible infrastructure in the Borgo where we lived. We have 10 apartments that have both kitchens, bedrooms, and baths, independent, as well as then common spaces that can be shared together. And we imagined this as a space that people could kind of come and connect together and live through this experience of transition together. And so, yeah, that idea was really born 10 years ago. And we've been working at it ever since. We were living in the US at the time. We slowly found our way to come to Italy with this group of activists working on imagining this idea. I'd had background in intentional community, and Federica had also lived in a number of community-based settings. So we tried to bring some of that, experience to work with, groups to develop, a model for how we could kind of articulate this project together as a community project. And then ultimately we sort of launched under our own management of the farm in 2020. So we'd done many years of preparing, working with folks, groups together. My wife did a PDC and did a lot of development of work in permaculture. I do a work in network facilitation and networking as my job. So we'd really imagine sort of bringing that into this context.
And just to interject real quick, in your job, your job is working with refugees to learn permaculture. Is that's correct?
Yeah, one of the roles that I have is as global coordinator for permaculture for refugees.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a global network of permaculture practitioners and educators working primarily with displaced people, teaching permaculture principles, skills, and in order to help displaced people apply them wherever they are. So in some cases, that's people in refugee camps. In some cases, that's people, as they move, en route to, their final destination, and then kind of everything in between. And so, I work on that primarily in an online capacity, coordinating, folks doing that work worldwide. We began in Australia. The main founder, Ro Morrow, is a permaculturalist from the early days of the permaculture movement in Australia. And then, from her contacts and other permaculturalists around the world, this network has formed, and we've recently incorporated as a nonprofit in Australia. And I sort of work to sort of be the network weaver in that community.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's get back to the story with this land project. You had some shocks to your system.
Yeah. So, our goal throughout was never to be a homestead in the sense of like an isolated, fully autonomous project off in the woods. We really wanted to be open to new members, to guests, for example. The Italian law allows for the idea of a kind of agritourism. So the idea is that we would sustain ourselves by having people come and stay on the farm, whether or not they were sort of bought into the overall vision of transition, also just to sustain ourselves economically, knowing that, of course, agriculture alone is hard to sustain ourselves with. And so we launched that project in January of 2020. And within 3 months, Italy was really the first, well, actually 2 months really, because it was in the first days of March that the global pandemic really hit first, sort of the global consciousness here in Italy. We had a group of Japanese guests here at that time who were just, it was really interesting to hear and experience the difference in their perception of having lived through other sort of global health crises. I think in some ways East Asia has had different experience and different approaches to dealing with major outbreaks of disease. And so, right from that moment, right at the beginning of our project, we were hit by having to really process and then close down all of the element of external guests coming to our place for several months, which in some ways, was incredibly disorienting. Again, it may maybe not have been a physical displacement, because in some ways we actually had then much more time for the farm itself, but it was a real disassociation, a real disillusionment in many ways with what we had imagined to be our plan for how we were going to create and sustain a kind of regenerative project in place, because we were essentially, cut off from what we had imagined has been a main source of income for many, many months. And so then we, in many ways, and all throughout this, part of the challenge we were then facing is we had many people coming through in transition, but we struggled to have that solid core of people who were living and working here And for example, COVID had a direct impact on that. I'm not sure if all the listeners are aware, but the Italian approaches to maintaining and containing COVID were very hands-on draconian. I mean, there were flying police patrols all along the road, and if you didn't present proper papers to show why you were moving from one place to the other, you could be fined and sanctioned pretty heavily. So, for example, there were many people who recently moved up at that time and then felt they couldn't actually even stay here because they had no sort of legal right to be here until we were able to establish residency and some of those things, which during the pandemic itself, as it was breaking out, we weren't able to do right away. And so, yeah, we had to sort of roll with that that experience. In many ways, I feel like we adapted and found other ways of sharing that which we had imagined to be planting for a much larger community in sort of locally organized CSA type food distribution programs. We did really rely on local networking to survive through that through those years. And then I think in some ways we really felt like at the end of last year things were starting to turn around when in the spring of this year, in May of 2023, for those who may have seen in the news, we were hit by what we're increasingly seeing happening all around the world of massive flooding. We got a significant part of our annual rainfall in 2 48-hour periods in early and mid-May. And after years of semi-drought, what ended up happening was the rivers burst their banks and flooded the lower parts of our region, and we're at about 300 meters or so. And our valley and several other valleys right next to it were just completely devastated by landslides. Our very small rural community had 27 massive landslides across all of the main roads in our area, which basically isolated all of the primary residential areas of our municipality. And we ourselves had half a dozen major landslides on our land, including our road basically washed completely away. So the only access road reaching our farm from the main road in the village below just basically slipped away. And so we once again were faced with this question. We got these calls from the local authorities as this was happening, saying, "You got to get out, you got to get out." And we said, where are we going to go? We have animals, and they're like, just get out, and then you will figure it out, because this was this sort of like central government saying you have to like leave whatever you've set up in order to then be kind of at the mercy of whatever plan we then subsequently make up. Because really, actually, the first place they'd sent displaced people from the flooding that began down in the lowlands was a place that then ultimately got flooded itself. So we're hearing this news and saying, no, thank you. I'd prefer to take my risks, being able to make sure my animals are okay, make sure that we, have food to eat, that's growing there. We stay united as a community rather than being at the mercy of local authorities. And so that's what we did. And it was challenging. We had to trek through the woods to eventually reach a vehicle to, off-road it through, massively damaged areas. But yeah, we were able to do it, and we did not expect that there would be significant government support for this. We were told point blank that our road was not a priority. So we launched a crowdfunding campaign basically to rebuild our publicly used road. And in many ways we were very successful. I mean, we saw a tremendous amount of solidarity come out, of all kinds of people, really saying, not just, here, I'm going to give you this money, but really, I felt like the message was a real validation of what we were trying to do, and an appreciation for this mission of offering a place of refuge, even though we ourselves needed support at that time. And so we were able, our neighbors, for example, by total chance, were road builders who had been who'd rented a major excavator just weeks before all this went down because they were doing work on their land. And luckily, when it all collapsed, they were able to begin basically, once we got permits and stuff in place, just rebuilding our road from scratch. We had to kind of deviate above the landslide. It wasn't possible to rebuild where it had been before because the damage was so massive. But through this grassroots organizing, we were really able to get back on our feet. And in the space of a month, the road was fully rebuilt. The money that we had was enough to at least, cover the first basic expenses. Hopefully one day there might be some government support, but we're not waiting on it. And yeah, so once again, it was just a matter of sort of picking up and saying, all right, we're gonna keep going forward with this. And I will admit, during COVID, during the road, there were many moments where I asked myself, like, is this the right choice? Like, you can look at the models and you can see that Italy is going to be a massive hotspot, at just a few degrees of warming. In many ways, this part of the world will be very difficult to live in and very difficult to cultivate food in.
Right.
And so I've asked myself many times, but I felt so sustained by the community around us to keep going that's what we've done until we now have the new challenge of a mortgage where the bank has decided to, as a result of the unrest, they pointed to the war in Ukraine even before the new war has begun in Israel and Palestine, and said, we're going to adjust your interest rate. And they've adjusted it so dramatically that it's very possible that we just can't afford to continue to pay our mortgage. So again, we're confronted by the situation of saying, is this, can we continue forward? And will we ultimately be displaced? What is that sort of final straw that that pushes us or this project over the edge? And that's really the place where we find ourselves now.
Okay, so you haven't decided yet. Like last time we talked, you mentioned that you were thinking about moving back to Pacific Northwest, to Cascadia, sorry. But that's not determined yet. You're still trying to, you've already weathered 2 shocks with COVID and with these storms, and you seem to be okay. And then the financial system came in and it was like, haha, actually, we have the last laugh here. And are you thinking of trying to weather this shock somehow, some way, or like where are you all leaning at this point?
I mean, it's really difficult to say. I mean, day to day, we go back and forth. I mean, I really think that whereas in a pandemic, there are certain common sense things that you can do to prevent further spread. And, obviously we live in a beautiful space where we can do a lot of things outdoors and potentially reduce the risk. Or in the case of the road, it's really clear that in order to continue to survive, we need a road. Or, I spoke mainly about the road, but there was also massive damage to our fields. We lost half of our main growing field. We lost the stall for our animals. Those are things that then are very, I think, concrete in terms of, yes, it's incredibly devastating, but it's also clear what one would need to do to carry forward. One needs to rebuild the road. One needs to take basic precautions in order to prevent transmission. In the case of the bank, I don't know. I mean, it feels much further out of our hands to come up with all of the money that would be needed to save the situation. Yeah. And so part of me says, hey, yeah, boy, if we just had that money, we could move forward and keep going. Part of me also says to myself, like, well, maybe this is the sort of end message that, it's not so much the permanence of a project that makes it worthwhile. It's the way in which and the spirit in which we bring, our solidarity and our energy to the place where we find ourselves. And if, for example, there isn't that sort of groundswell of local support to make it happen, and I'm not implying that all of our neighbors now need to pitch in to pay our mortgage, but short of something like that, I'm not certain what the future forward might look like.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I can imagine, throughout this conversation, we're talking about dispossession, but through various means, right? Like different forms of dispossession. And we've also talked a little bit about permaculture. And of course, to me, kind of the core philosophy of permaculture is permanent agriculture, right? It's building in place for permanence, long and slow solutions. You plant nut trees that you'll harvest from in 30 years, things of that nature. And it's about creating resilient communities, regenerative communities that are built for the long term. But then, and this is, of course, all these principles you're well familiar with. But throughout your life, you've been aware of and now experienced yourself, just how unstable this world is for a lot of people. How many people are being dispossessed through various means, and will probably continue to be dispossessed in the future, probably increasingly so, right? Given all of the best practices, you build all of the swales, all of the whatever, and you still have these landslides, right? Or the political situation changes and you're forced off your land, or the financial system changes and you're forced off your land. Yeah, I mean, how do you this is a kind of a tension, I think, even a tension within that permaculturalists don't often recognize or acknowledge. And of course, you're teaching permaculture to refugees, often in temporary situations, which is inherently, even there, kind of a bit of a contradiction. Like, how do you how, I mean, it's an active question, but how are you thinking through these tensions?
Yeah, well, like, for example, one thing that I think about related to that question in the context of a refugee is like a crucial part of permaculture is observing our surroundings, right? And even if those surroundings ultimately are temporary for us, like, how can we best leverage the resources and not waste that which is around us in order to regenerate the best we can with what we have. So, for example, one thing I'll just offer that we frequently hear and talk about in permaculture for refugees, which would make many permaculturalists cringe, is like, what's one of the most permanent resources available worldwide in all kinds of situations? It's plastic. There's plastic everywhere. There's plastic bottles, there's plastic bags all over the place, and many of the refugee camps in particular are full of waste plastic that's just sitting there, and we can say to ourselves, this is terrible, we need to clean up the plastic, how do we deal with this waste product? But at the other hand, if that is a primary resource that's available to you, how might you be able to, for example, use plastic bottles to catch rainwater off the top of your tent to then use it at a time when you're dealing with drought? How might you be able to plant plants in waste plastic, which is going to be more resilient than the best kind of mud and wattle thing that you might be able to make, which you might have to destroy again in a week's time because you're moved out of the camp anyway. These are, I think, real questions that we as permaculturalists need to ask ourselves. Like, is it about the purity of the principle of I'm going to make this awesome food forest that I will appreciate the benefits of 30 years from now? Or am I going to really observe that which is around me and perhaps now compromise with that which I have right here, and maybe even plant a seedling that I can carry with me to eventually plant in the food forest where I find myself long term? But in the short term, I think we can't let perfection be the enemy of good, and we use in a lot of the intentional community movement the principles of sociocracy, which is another way of kind of group decision making. We talk about good enough for now, safe enough to try. Like, we don't know what's going to be happening tomorrow, a month from now, a year from now. How can we best live as genuinely and as close to the principles that we believe in as possible, with as minimal impact on the land or the people around us, so as to genuinely regenerate the best we can in the circumstances in which we find ourselves.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm still just, relatedly, I'm thinking through just, what the future holds in terms of, just the challenges associated with so many people that are effectively homeless, moving around, right? If we believe the climate projections, there will be hundreds of millions of climate refugees, in the next few decades. Probably geopolitical refugees will probably amp up related to climate, right? Political refugees, etc. And contrasting this with trying to create stable communities, right? In order to think, say, to build community or think bioregionally, there has to be some degree of stability. But how can this stability be flexible enough to, say, bring in refugees, and help them acclimate to a regenerative system if they're not already familiar and have been practicing already? And perhaps, I think one potential opportunity, problem is a solution, is that, in terms of, building resilience, refugees, are probably the world-class experts. Of course, not, not against their will, they had to be, right? But that's a very, useful skill set that I think communities that are more established, that are trying to build a sense of consistency intergenerationally and traditions based on place. This could, one way to frame it to, is, for me, is like, what new skill sets can be brought in, and how can this problem become a solution or a win-win for multiple people?
Yeah, I mean, I really agree that that displaced people can be an amazing resource if we allow them to be. Mm-hmm. And one of the key things that I think many of your listeners could agree with, because I'm sure they're self-selected beyond the sort of average person in public, is we get so many requests to come stay at our project and learn about community life and get close to the land. And we see in those people that come, many of them, not displaced, a tremendous challenge with practical skills. Many people aspire to know how to plant and grow their own food or take care of animals. But we are so divorced from that experience.
It seems to be an epidemic in Western society, is lack of practical skills.
Exactly. So part of our goal in creating the space of refuge and the space of transition for people was also to create a space where some of those skills were transmitted, and each one teach one within this context to provide a basis for mutual aid where it's absolutely lacking. There's good relations between neighbors in rural communities, and we know how that works, but there are a tremendous number of particularly young people. There's an unemployment crisis in Italy. So many young people are out of work and at loose ends, still living with their parents, and struggle to just basically engage with their natural surroundings. And I think the opportunity that we have here is that Italy has also been talking now for the last, almost a decade, of the crisis of immigrants, overrunning, the current fascist government that we have in Italy really was ushered in on a wave of anti-immigrant sentiment. But many of these immigrants who are coming to Italy have had to overcome tremendous physical and practical challenges to get here, come up with huge sums of money, cross deserts, on foot, find ways to get a boat across the Mediterranean to arrive here. I'm not saying that there's some innate practical skill that comes with that. But the challenge that migration and forced displacement causes, just as you say, can provide tremendous opportunities for people to build resilience, but also cultivate critical skills that all of us are going to need. And to the extent that we point the finger and other those folks as coming from different cultures, as not not contributing to society in the way that we'd wish, or enclaving themselves or things of that kind, that's a big part of the discourse here in Italy. I think we miss out on all of that which we could be learning from them, which may not, once again, be, as I talked about in terms of my experience of Turkey, may not be a happy multicultural, oh, you eat this way and I eat that way, wow, that's so cool, but like a whole nother worldview on like what precariousness looks like and what the future might hold and what kinds of skills and knowledge and practical application will be necessary for us to survive another century.
Yeah. I mean, I think any way you slice it, it's going to be challenging. I'd like to believe. I think that's a beautiful vision that you put forward. I mean, as much as I personally, I cringe at like kind of what are generally thought of as like xenophobic attitudes, but at the same time, I also empathize with like the feeling. And this is a different situation, but like in the United States, there's a feeling among a lot of rural people that that there's a lot of newcomers coming in, usually on the wings of gentrification, right? New kind of investment projects, new money coming in, displacing people from the land through property taxes or enclosing their ecological base with hunting and gathering and various things, and just people coming in who don't kind of understand or respect kind of the local traditions, kind of the tacit knowledge of the place, and kind of the immense frustration with that, right? And of course, this can also be the case with very rapid kind of cultural clash as well, right? With just a whole new set of people coming in. And I also empathize with that, right? Like there needs to be some kind of continuity for a place to be a place. And so I don't really see, I wonder if you want to talk more about that, of like this ideal of being able to welcome in, especially people who have been uprooted against their will, right, in precarious situations that need a new home, and welcoming them in while at the same time not undermining kind of existing kind of cultural bases that have allowed the natives, quote unquote, to survive and live there. Like, do you want to expound on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting for me to live in a second culture and experience a really different way of perceiving that challenge, because so I'm originally from the US, that it's written right there that our motto is E pluribus unum, and even if we don't live that out all the time, there's this at least baseline understanding that we're a nation of immigrants. Italy doesn't have that understanding, and immigration and migration was never considered a like positive, enriching possibility. Italy was ruled by others. Even within its regionality, there was the papal state that controlled this area, and so there's a tremendous suspicion of sort of outsiders coming to basically tell us what to do, or force us into ways of life that are not our own. And I get that, and within that, I think there's a sort of a false association in that narrative here, that in my region here in Romagna, this bioregion was under the papal state, was under various sort of ducates and lords that were distant and ruling by fiat, often with complete disregard for local feeling, and And frankly, I don't see that as too drastically different than the centralized government that we have today, right? And we're being told like these are the things that you need to do, to believe in. We're going to tax you this way or that way, and we'll tell you what's best for you. Today Italy is increasingly old. Italians are not having children. Basic infrastructure is crumbling. Rural communities are depopulating as people move into urban centers looking for work and opportunities. And in many ways, I've seen in our immediate area that migrants have filled that gap. One of our local municipalities here has one of the largest percentages of immigrants with respect to native-born Italians in the country. And that is not always an easy, not always an easy thing. There's a strong presence of the far right in that municipality. People backlashing against that thing, but there's also a tremendous number of immigrants who work with elderly people as like in-home care folks that otherwise might have been forced to move into the city just to be in a rest home, so are able to like live in their homes with the support of an immigrant who comes and supports them. I struggle to see how that is bad for us in the end. And I think it's important that, despite what the neo-fascists will say, I think it's hard for me to focus too much on the ideological highfalutin, and this is easy for me to say as an immigrant myself, but like, what is Italian values and our Italian identity in the face of these really practical challenges that we're facing right now? Those immigrants themselves were washed out and dealing with the same landslides and mucking things out in the same way that I and other native-born Italians were in these last things. In the face of these crises, these are people who also want to live well, who also want to build community to the extent that we're able to welcome them and integrate them into where we find ourselves. So yes, we can push back against the way that they eat or act or pray differently. But at the end of the day, I think with the very, very practical challenges that we're going to be facing moving forward, like we're not going to have a lot of choice. It's going to be, who is my neighbor today when my road collapses, and can I trust them? And can I work with them? Maybe not be on agreement on all aspects of what I have, of all points of worldview, but enough to just get that road rebuilt or figure out how we're going to move forward together.
Yeah. Okay. I'm thinking the idea of the commons just came up. And of course, the first principle that Elinor Ostrom identified was clear boundaries. I'm curious what you think about, and of course, the purpose of clear boundaries in her framework is that it needs to be clear both who can benefit from the resource and also who has responsibility to help maintain the resource, right? And I can imagine if there's too much fluidity or too much kind of transition or chaos, it's hard to be able to determine, okay, who has responsibility for this resource, right? And so can you even maintain a resource under those conditions? But of course, we're not living under stable conditions, like perhaps certain societies in the past who have had their commons for hundreds of years and have been successful. What do these principles of the commons and thinking in terms of the commons mean, especially the first principle, in the context that we're talking about?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And I think it gets back to what I was sharing before about like practical ability. I think we've taken the commons for granted. I think we've taken infrastructure for granted. I think we've taken decision making by elected leaders for granted. And as a result, the commons where I am is diminished, for sure. And I will also say that as an immigrant to this community, I really struggle with negotiating, like, what are the boundaries? What are the responsibilities? There is not an Italian word for commitment or accountability or, some of these things that for me are crucial to, the foundations of effective mutual aid and, community grassroots organizing. I think without those agreements and without those clear boundaries, I have seen over and over again how when push comes to shove, many shove off.
Yeah.
I think, though, we absolutely need to be prepared, as you say, for that becoming increasingly chaotic and that becoming increasingly urgent.
Right.
It might be interesting for your US listeners to think about the fact that, like, for example, here in Italy, we still really have the benefit of like public health care and a pretty functional public education system, and that doesn't cost anywhere near what we've gotten used to paying in the US, which is amazing. And unfortunately, at the same time, I think feeds into a sense of like, well, I'm going to complain about the things that don't work, but I'm not really necessarily going to like invest in making them work better, because I'm not used to like having to hustle to get what I need. But inevitably, I think all of us are going to be experiencing what is already very present in the US of late stage capitalism, where really those who can afford to get healthcare or good schooling can, and those who can't don't. And those that organize as communities to provide that for themselves, for their own commons,
Mm.
are ultimately, I think, those who will be most resilient and successful as we move forward.
Right, right. And somehow we need to be figuring out how to make it's almost like, whereas historically the commons have taken several decades, if not centuries, to evolve, to fine tune the right set of rules and commitments, etc. And whereas now we're dealing with a situation that's much more in flux, with people who don't really know each other, people who might not be committed to that place. Like, and perhaps your work with teaching permaculture to refugees might, maybe some of the projects that your organization is involved in, might be insightful here. But like, how do we create a, like, almost like a commons on demand that inherently requires some kind of trust, requires evolution of proper institutions, but now in a situation where we don't often have that time, we don't often have that trust.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to take small steps. I think, for example, it takes if it's something that's completely unfamiliar, if we've always taken the commons for granted, if we've always taken our own ability to be stable in the place that we live for granted, it's obvious that we're going to struggle when that's turned upside down. So, for example, anything from like participating in a CSA and realizing that you're like helping support a small time farmer, sustain their business, all the way to, maybe like in the case of the community where I was born, rallying together to like bring suit against the logging community that's destroying your watershed, and all the space in between. We've got to experiment with some of these things. And I see, for example, in the projects of permaculture for refugees, like there needs to be a constant feedback loop on that. It's not like we can just say, oh, we're going to go and like teach people cool techniques for permaculture and then, give them a pat on the back and say, have a nice life. We need to continue to be in constant contact and understanding that in some cases people are actually going to be moving, their situations are going to change. I'll give one example. One of the permaculture trainings that we did through Permaculture for Refugees in 2018, 2019 was in camps in southern Turkey, so along the border with Syria, where there were many displaced people, Syrians particularly, coming across as a result of the civil war in Syria. And there was a tremendous need in those camps for people to have practical skills to sustain themselves. Interestingly, the situation of refugees in Turkey is that they've been used a lot as sort of political pawns. The Central Turkish government has played Turks off each other and with and using Syrians as a way of kind of like guilting Turks into like supporting our Muslim brethren. And as a result, I think it's driven even more of a wedge, I think, between local communities and the refugees who are there. Um, and so then what happened, we saw earlier this year that there was this massive earthquake in that area. It's a very earthquake-prone region. There have been many earthquakes there over the years. But we saw a tremendous degree of organizing amongst Turkish permaculturalists to respond to that emergency, not just to create the nth refugee or displaced persons camp, which now was not just for Syrians, but also for Turks who had been displaced out of their land. But how can we together use principles of permaculture to respond to the situation? So just one example is housing is a tremendous problem in that area because it's another arid desert region. Gets incredibly hot in the summertime, incredibly cold in the wintertime. Many people were being set up to live in shipping containers, which then required like air conditioning units to keep them cold in the summer and heater units to keep them warm in the winter. There's no way you can consider that sustainable, especially with all of the main routes and both for train and trucks being cut off in certain parts of that earthquake hit area. So one of the key projects of one of our partners in Turkey was to work on more locally sourced sort of modular building units that people could install and set up in the places where they found themselves in those really earthquake hit areas, to just begin to rebuild infrastructure right from the ground up, at least have a home and a roof over their heads. Understanding that a shipping container is like made with the understanding of it being temporary. But we can see refugees in Gaza now living in refugee camps that are now being bombarded, who started out in tents and then built a cement structure, where the tent was, to then still hope that one day they would return to their home in Israel or in other parts of the area, only to find that after 70 plus years, they're still displaced. They're still waiting for their just situation. So going back to the situation in Turkey right now, to build a modular home that can be then fairly simply dismantled and then brought to another place when and if that time is possible, allows and accepts the reality of the uncertainty of the situation, and also then hopefully bakes in a sense of like some degree of autonomy and ownership over something that may not require that we are on exactly this piece of land or at exactly this place that we find ourselves right now, still bringing some degree of resource, both knowledge and material, that we can if we do have to move.
Okay, interesting. Well, we should probably wrap up pretty soon, but I want to give you the opportunity to, if there's any kind of discussion topics that you would still like to explore that you haven't really covered, anything else that you want to bring up in the conversation?
I mean, I think one thing that's key here, and I am sorry, my wife had hoped to join us and for logistical reasons was not going to, but I mean, I do think it's important at times for us to look around our permaculture communities and say, who's here in the room, who's participating in these conversations. And frequently it's folks with a lot of privilege and a lot of people who've, maybe had a college degree and decided that even though they've had a higher education, they're going to go back and work the land, which maybe doesn't even require a degree, and I don't want to speak for my wife, for example, but she's a first generation college student. She grew up on this farm, and her family really built up this place without a lot of resources, besides their own sweat equity to make it happen. And I carry that with me, coming from a much more privileged background. My parents chose to go back to the land. I have in many ways much more of a like safety net to fall on. So how can we look at the projects that we do, look at the ways in which we imagine permaculture, look at the ways in which we think about displacement, or even begin to imagine our own displacement, and think about how we can be of service to those who are marginalized or even just simply less privileged than we are in whatever we do. Because in many instances, my experience is that those folks have skills and life experiences that prepare them, I think, in some ways, in ways that, in a very self-serving way, can benefit those of us who've had much easier lives. And at the same time, I think it's just right and just to imagine, a future where we're not living premised on exploitation. We don't have to live where one person has to be oppressed for another to have what they need. And that is so fundamentally baked into the way in which we're currently living that even as we imagine future utopias, we struggle at times, I think, to look past that. And we think about, how am I going to get mine? How am I going to learn the skills that I need to do what works for me? And we forget that there's a much bigger system and humanity around us who ultimately, needs to be raised up together. And once again, I've said it before, I'll say it again, has the common enemy of a capitalist exploitative system that tells us we need to fight against each other to benefit a very, very few of us who are not going to have problems in the way we're going to have them because they've got the money and the resources and the influence to do whatever they want, no matter what. We gotta stop, being crabs in a barrel and find ways to collaborate, because increasingly we're going to have not as much chance or choice around that.
Right. Yeah. And I think the demographic you're describing of like recognizing their privilege of, highly educated, wanting to go back to the land. I'm in that demographic as well. And in some ways, not, this is in no way a victim narrative, but I feel very underprivileged in the sense that I got into it not knowing any practical skills. Right. And I've been trying to learn some, and it's incredibly difficult, obviously. And so I recognize that the people that I need to reach out to help me are, people who, might be, a local refugee community or immigrant community who, actually knows how to slaughter a pig, for example. Right. And that's, I think for me, I think the attitude is, the attitude of one population is privileged, the other population is not. The population that's privileged needs to help the population that's not. That only goes so far, right? I think, and that might be a first step, but I think a more ultimately regenerative attitude is that we each have a set of assets and skills and abilities, and they're different. And so recognizing, how we can benefit each other, to help meet our basic needs and live fulfilling lives, it is ultimately, it's the most ennobling for everybody, right? It's eventually getting out of who's the victim, who's the oppressor, and going into what do I lack, what do you lack, how can we help each other out? And I know I lack a lot, even though I'm highly educated, mostly in the wrong things. By the way, but and not blame anyone for that, but that was the culture that I came into, of like, you need to leave, you need to get an education, you need to leave home, right? And that's just kind of me as an historical subject having to do that. But now I'm finding myself very much lacking, not so much in, I guess, cultural capital, but lacking in abilities that now I'm recognizing that all of us are going to really need.
Yeah. Well, and I really appreciate, for example, listening to your podcast, I see that you're using this as a platform to work some of that out and talk about it and share some of those skills. And I don't want to diminish that in any way. I think the thing is that we still just need to acknowledge that the majority of food that comes to our plate in the United States, for example, is still harvested, grown, planted by immigrants. And there's a tremendous set of skills and knowledge and, frankly, infrastructure provided by people living and making that possible for us
Mhm.
that often is untapped. And I think sometimes as we imagine perfect permaculture utopias,
Mhm.
we forget that we could be drawing in friends. This happens also for us here in Italy. Much of the agricultural sector is held up also by immigrants here in this area, and we've worked with migrant folks here on the farm, talking about skills and principles of permaculture, for example, but also getting really good feedback about like, well, that's great, and like based on my experience of like harvesting, figs this way, for hours on end, like, have you thought about the way in which the pitch can be super itchy after the like 100th tree, like
Mhm.
if I have just the number of trees just for myself, that's one kind of calculus. But
Mhm.
if I can really factor in the experience of those who are doing that to really underpin, our mine and our collective lifestyle in a much more large scale way, I
Mhm.
think we have a tremendous resource in that. I think we have a tremendous opportunity in that, not just in a sort of kumbaya, oh, you teach me and I teach you, but to like really fundamentally imagine the scale and scope of what's going to need to be reinvented
Mhm.
for the more regenerative bioregional communities that we're going to need to create moving forward.
Yeah. Well said. I think that's a good place to end it. So thank you, Evan. This has been a very very fascinating conversation, and I really wish you the best in whatever you and your family decides in terms of where you end up staying or going. And hoping keep in touch, and perhaps in a year or two, once your kind of longer term situation has been settled, we can jump back on and have another conversation about what it took to go through that decision.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you again
Yeah.
for this chance. This began really as me being interested in you exploring the theme of Israel and Palestine, and just being really curious to see the interconnection between that theme and this wider question of doom or optimism. So I really appreciate the chance to sort of explore it more in depth, and I'll definitely keep in touch as our situation develops. So thank
All
you.
right. Great, Evan. Talk to you later.
Thanks, Jason. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.